Welcome back. It's early in the morning. Halftime was just splendid. I'll tell you, there's a lot of brain power in here. We have a Wharton School graduate. We have the president of Town Square Media. We have another genius, the pride of Cornell University, and, of course, their wonderful hotel management school, Chuck Malamut. He's an incredible student, too, Malamut. I am Hurley in the morning, the lowliest on the totem pole. And this is our regular Tuesday morning program starring Chuck Malamut, all about your financial matters. Chuck, day one. Kirk, thank you.
Adios.
Thanks for a great hour, my friend. Chuck is in his 26th year here as our official financial advisor for the Hurley in the Morning program. Chuck is the managing director. He leads his team, the Malamut Group, at Morgan Stanley's Northfield, New Jersey office. You can reach Chuck and his team at 609-383-2010. And the following program is presented by Chuck Malamut, a financial advisor at Morgan Stanley. The information, views, and opinions expressed on this program are those of Chuck and do not necessarily reflect those of Morgan Stanley or its affiliates. They are current as of the date of this broadcast and subject to change without notice. Neither the information provided nor any opinion expressed herein constitutes a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. This presentation is for informational purposes only. Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, member SIPC. Chuck, how are you, my good friend?
Good morning, Harry.
Good morning to you.
Quite an hour to follow with Harry, Kirk, and Joe G.
Joe G. Maybe someday he'll call and say, Chuck and Harry, Joe G here. Oh, I forgot. Kirk is probably just about in his car. A good friend of mine, I'll just say his name is Mike, wanted me to talk Kirk into running. We'll get into that at 9:05 because I'm going to share. I've written a very definitive column about the race for the New Jersey legislative seats, and we're filling people in this week in our weekly column in the Current and the Gazette newspapers all throughout Atlantic and Cape May counties in a manner that no one yet in the media has been able to crystallize exactly what's going on. I'm going to give you a little bit of a advanced copy of that column coming up in less than an hour. But for the next 45 minutes or thereabouts, until Chuck walks out the studio door, we're going to talk about your financial matters with Chuck, and I open it up for your opening comment, Chuck.
So Harry, it's again another week in the books and another week of gains for the major averages. So the S&P up 1.5% for the week. And that, in fact, recorded, Harry, the fourth consecutive weekly advance. I mean, think about this. This is just
that's a record.
Unprecedented.
Yeah, record.
Now, if you look at that particular benchmark, it has posted gains in 5 of the last 7 weeks so far in 2017, increasing at a rate of 5%. So, I think in spite of everything that's being created by the media in Washington, or actually not just Washington, but everything around our president and the people that he wants to put in command with him, the market, Harry, has pretty much ignored it, which is actually a good thing. The market, as we kind of talked about.
I was going to say that to you, Chuck. I find it absolutely just very, very positive and fascinating that our financial markets are ignoring all of the what you would call geopolitical, I'll use the word insanity, that's happening along
I don't want to call it geopolitical risk because quite frankly, Harry, I don't really think it's risk.
I take it back. You're right.
I think it's geopolitical hysteria.
Yes.
In a perfect sense. I mean, it's where
how come the markets don't care? Are they this focused that they can actually say, we don't care about this static noise, we don't care about this Russia, insanity and hysteria and media, what I call derangement syndrome, and they are just looking at the policies, it seems.
Well, it is, because they're focusing on, what could potentially happen with healthcare, what could potentially happen with tax reform, not only from an individual taxpayer's perspective, but also the corporate taxpayer. And as Kirk mentioned in his last hour, the market is a leading indicator looking at what they think will be happening anywhere from the next 6 to 18 months.
Let me ask you this, because we didn't know it then, but we know it now in the rearview mirror. When President Reagan enacted what will be similar policies, because really President Trump is doing what President Reagan did. He's going to lower tax rates on corporations. He's going to lower tax rates on the individual citizens. So we know, and we know that President Kennedy did it as well in the 60s. So we know in the 60s it was done by a Democrat. We know in the 80s it was done by a Republican. It's going to be done again in this era, in the 2000s, in the second decade of the 2000s, by this president. And it's going to work again, in my humble estimation. But what's amazing about this is all this crazy stuff that would normally, I think, rattle markets and prevent what we have been seeing, this unprecedented, week after week after week after week, even if I said it 4 times, I'm accurate, of growth. None of that stuff is getting in the way. And with Reagan, it was a much simpler time. And we didn't know it then, because obviously it seemed very complex, and hostages were being held by Iran. There was tension with, if they were called then, the Soviet Union, I think. That was going on. So, but by today's comparison, it was a simpler time. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And it took Reagan 2 years, though, to really get, all of the tax stuff done. How much patience do you think markets have in this more minute rice society that we live in now? I don't think we get 2 years anymore.
No, I agree. And I think the markets will be patient as long as the earnings are there. And if earnings, for instance, this morning Walmart beat the number. The bottom line slightly missed the top line. I just saw as I walked in here, Macy's beat their number.
Good.
Ever so slightly, but that's a whole other phenomena. What's happening with bricks and mortar retail? We talked about this years ago and the potential demise, and then ultimately, the advent of online shopping, and I think that's going to unfortunately continue. And the bricks and mortar folks are going to be certainly more pressed, but there's still a lot to be said to have a bricks and mortar and then have a very, very strong online presence. So, I think good for Macy's that they beat the number this morning. There's been again last week at the end of the week $143 billion potential takeover of Unilever by Kraft Heinz, which Unilever, flatly rejected unilaterally, like within minutes. And then it's kind of interesting because this came Friday, and then over the weekend, Kraft Heinz said, "That's it, we're going to walk away from it." So I'm not. I mean, I think maybe they're just out there fishing, but I mean, it's when you look at that particular part of the market, it's very, very interesting to see that there's been a fair amount of interest of late. You're holding your hand up.
Yes.
Are you waving for somebody?
I'm waving. I'm holding my hand up, waiting for Professor Malamut to let me ask him a question. So I was raising my hand.
Harry, you've never raised your hand. Never waited before. Are you okay? Something?
No, you're just. I'm a very polite man. I was raised the right way with 2 great parents. Even though I lost them when they were very young and I was very young, I was raised the right way. So I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on such a roll. So I was just raising my hand like when you're in school, asking for the professor or the teacher to call on you. And I want to ask you about this in terms of where we're going and why financial markets have ignored the outside static noise. What do you think it would mean if we lower tax rates for corporations and for the citizens? We've seen the model of the 3 tax rates, and I think it would be very meaningful. What are your thoughts of what that would mean for the American economy if this happens?
Well, Harry, let's also talk about the repatriation.
That's right. Trillions of dollars. That's in there too.
So if you kind of take a look at what we think will be happening over the next several years with respect to the Trump administration, the potential tax reforms could produce a significant tailwind for equities. The proposed reforms could end up boosting economic growth in not only in the short term but also in the longer term. And as you look at tax reform, we've seen it before in previous administrations, it's going to create winners, it's going to create losers.
Chuck, have the great analysts at Morgan Stanley and elsewhere, has anyone taken a position yet where they feel GDP goes with these policies?
Yeah, actually, Harry, when you take a look at it, well, let's talk about S&P for a minute, because I think that ultimately is going to, kind of answer your question. So, if we end up reducing the corporate tax rate, again, we think it's going to have a significant impact on after-tax earnings on a per-share basis. We always talk about EPS for most of the S&P 500 companies. So, if you drop the corporate tax rate from the current 35% to 20%, and again, I don't know if that's the number. That's the number that Ryan has thrown out there as he's proposing. That could result in over a 7% increase in the S&P 500 earnings.
Fantastic, and I think that will be the compromise number, because you have to arrive at a number that you can pass.
Yeah. So I mean, look. So Ryan's number is 20.
Yeah,
and that would in fact create a change in after-tax income or earnings per share of roughly 7.2%. If Trump, the number got to 20%, which I agree with you, I think it's going to be quite a stretch. I'm sorry, if Trump number went, Ryan's at 20, if Trump goes to 15.
Yeah, I don't know if they get 15.
If they went to 15, the guesstimate is that you're going to end up with a percentage change of almost 14% in earnings per share. Now, think about that for a second. And I was just I was listening to you and Kirk this morning as you were talking about Trump, and what is happening on a day-to-day basis with the media. And I actually I was in another part of the house yesterday. My wife came in and turned on she came back, turned on the television, and she immediately, I think she watches Fox News and Fox Business, and all unsolicited, by the way. I never encouraged Pam to do that. And I finally said, you got to turn this off. I said, I can't. I said, it's Monday. I'm concentrating on what I need to do for tomorrow. I don't want to listen to this. And she goes, no, you have to understand what's going on in the world. I said, it's easy. I said, what's going on in the world is that you just have the media just day in and day out just absolutely crucifying our president. And I'll tell you what, Harry, I mean, I know that our hour is not political, but this guy, it's pretty remarkable how anybody can just stand up there, take it, and just give it right back to him and just keep moving on. It doesn't bother him. It's incredible.
I know. It is extraordinary. We're going to take our first break. We're going to be right back. Don't go away. This portion of our program, of course, presented by Chuck Malamut, the official financial advisor to the Hurley in the Morning program. For all of your financial planning needs, turn to the Malamut Group, 609-383-2010. Chuck will introduce you to his, I think, incredibly successful concept of total asset management coupled with the all-important asset allocation, 609-383-2010. We're also brought to you by another dear friend, Dr. Alan Chenman, the official dentist to the Hurley in the Morning program. And Dr. Chenman, literally, they do it all. At the Smile Center of Linwood, they practice the full scope of general, cosmetic, and implant dentistry. And we've really used them for just about everything. I guess technically, I could even say cosmetic to an extent. I've done the implant there. We've done always the general dentistry. They do an incredible job. They do it all. Porcelain veneers, dental implants, crowns, bridges, inlays, onlays. Dr. Chenman can correct the wide variety of the permanent cosmetic dental problems. The important thing to do is to make your appointment, because that's the first step towards a beautiful, healthy smile. Call Shannon, Dr. Chenman, scheduling appointment coordinator, 609-601-2199. Then you'll head on over at your allotted appointment schedule to 1999 New Road, Suite D in Linwood. Dr. Alan Chenman, cosmetic and general dentistry, perfecting the art of beautiful smiles. We'll be back with Chuck in just a few minutes. All about your financial matters with Chuck Malamut continues. 22 minutes past the hour, Hurley in the Morning with Chuck Malamut, our official financial advisor to the Hurley in the Morning program, and Chuck is way into his opening comments in terms of the market update. Chuck, time is yours.
Harry, I also forgot to mention earlier this morning that the earnings parade continued onward and upward in Home Depot.
Yes.
Again, another beat. So I think what you're seeing is, again, more a shift out of more of the traditional fixed income.
Is it still companies, Chuck, making bottom line, missing top line, or a
seeing,
combination?
Well, you're seeing a combination of both, but unfortunately, you still have a number of companies that are in fact missing on the top line.
If you miss the top line, but you make the bottom line, as a general rule, do you avoid getting hammered because you at least made the bottom line? That way, as a company, you made adjustments and said, we're not going to make the revenue projection where we need to, but we're going to get to our bottom line because we're going to do things, whether it's purchasing differently or streamlining employees or whatever the case might be. Do you get quasi saved, or I'll use the word rewarded, when you at least make the bottom line?
I think, Harry, what happens is that I think you said it perfectly, if it's sort of on a go-forward-looking statement, when you make your announcement, and then part of that announcement, you also get more into the details as far as, what your anticipation is, over the next, 1 to 4 quarters with respect to revenue and earnings. So, ultimately, a company that misses on the top line makes it on the bottom line, but has a decent go forward looking, statements. The company should do relatively well. It's not going to get demolished per se. So,
but if you miss top line and bottom line,
you're going
to get hit.
Yeah, that's obvious. So let's go back for a second, Harry. Before the break, we were talking about the potential tax reform and what that and what that could mean. So you have the corporate tax rate, potential reduction. You have a simplification of the personal tax brackets, and ultimately reduction in the personal income tax rates. If that happens, then think about this: consumer confidence, which I think we're seeing already, it will continue to increase, and that's going to encourage spending.
Chuck, I mentioned to Kirk, and it isn't just one survey, but the very well-known liberal Harvard University survey, 61% of the American people, this is as of about 24 to 36 hours ago, have believed that the American economy is strong. We haven't seen that number in a decade or more.
No. So, and then I'm going to kind of circle back here for a second, because let's talk about just for a second about repatriation.
Yep.
Repatriation. So there's been a discussion and multiple discussions about how are you going to get this money back into the U.S. And that's either going to be done, Harry, with a one-time low tax rate holiday, so to speak.
What you got to do,
or an extended period of tax breaks on those respective profits. So that, again, you bring that money back, that's going to potentially spur more corporate buybacks or stock buybacks, which ultimately ends up in, you have total take total earnings divided by total earnings by total earnings divided by shares equals earnings per share,
and more development, more hiring of employees. This would be
and then,
enormous.
Yeah, and then ultimately, if that happens, then you're going to have a continuation of these potential, mergers, acquisitions, and other like.
Chuck, I know what the question I was thinking of earlier when I was raising my hand, and I want to remember to ask this question in a moment, but let me follow up on that point in the form of a question for you to respond. When you have no way of really knowing, because the whole idea is it's not here, so we really don't know, is there a reasonable guesstimate? I know it's in the trillions. I've heard 2.5. I've heard up to 5 trillion. I mean, is it such a wild range because we just don't know, right?
Yeah, Harry, I'm not sure of the number. I did see it a few days ago, and I unfortunately didn't grasp it. But I mean, you have companies like Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, Apple. This one article I read identified 10 multinationals that have, and it showed what could potentially come back. And I was pretty, you look at it, you're pretty astonished with the numbers. So
it is many trillions, right?
Yeah. So, if you think about this for a second, with the respect of, repatriation, if you're able to increase earnings and reduce the number of outstanding shares, then that's going to increase your EPS.
Doesn't that one issue, and I know President Trump, I know him, he's going to do this because he knows what that will mean. Won't that make these companies flush in a way that they were not able to put on their American books, and it should be a juggernaut?
Well, yeah. I mean, not only do you increase your earnings and your earnings per share, but you also have that cash to do potentially expansions as well within your company, which ultimately increases the labor force.
Chuck, we're going to get our halftime break in, and when we come back, I would like you to respond to the following. And I know you still have many points on today's program. You're going to talk about the Fed. You have talked about the Trump tax reform. And we're also going to, again, we haven't mentioned this in a while, Greece. Chuck will talk about the Greek bailout deadline and where that stands at the moment. But a question I want to pose to Chuck now, and we'll talk about it when we come back, is when you know the person, you know how they're going to proceed. And with President Trump and everything that we know, it is my belief that mergers that used to get knocked out in the previous 8 years, I think more mergers will be approved. I want to see if Chuck agrees with that, just as a general statement. It's not to say that if something is, it's just too big and it would lead to a monopoly or something, that even this administration, this is not deadwood. Everything doesn't go. But I think there is going to be a much more pleasant environment for companies that decide that they would like to blend and to strengthen by two becoming one, and even bigger types of mergers than in the past would automatically really not even get off the ground because people would not even pursue them because they knew. The same thing I'm saying now. They knew the tendencies of the previous administration. We'll see if Chuck thinks there's any validity to that. We're going to come back in a few minutes. One more power segment with the official financial advisor to Hurley in the Morning, Chuck Malamut. For all of your financial planning needs, turn to the Malamut Group at Morgan Stanley's Northfield office, 609-383-2010. 34 minutes past the hour. Chuck Malamut is here for all of your financial planning needs. Turn to the Malamut Group. They're right here in Northfield, very near the palatial studios of Hurley in the Morning at Broadcast Center, Town Square Media, Atlantic City. We're at 950 Tilton Road for many, many decades. Morgan Stanley's own Chuck Malamut and the Malamut Group, 609-383-2010 for all of your financial planning needs. Before we get into the Fed and some other things, Chuck, that you're going to talk about, give us your tutelage on, does the sort of track record of the President of the United States as a businessman, things that he said during the campaign, things he's already done, does that create a completely different atmosphere for companies that might now spring up and decide to do, because it's lengthy. There's legal on both teams. It's a very arduous process. And if you think it's going nowhere, many times you won't even do the work because it's, you're just sort of spitting in the wind and it hits you back in the face. I think there's every reason to believe that responsible mergers and acquisitions will have a much better climate during this era than the previous 8 years.
Well, Harry, if you remember during the campaign and then right after the election, the AT&T Time Warner deal, potential deal, President Trump was just all over that early on
against it
and said, "There's absolutely no way I'm going to approve this." So if that sort of sets the precedent, on a go-forward basis, because I haven't heard much other than right after the election about that. But here's
what I'm saying. I agree. I understand how he processed that. He saw that as too big, monopolistic, and something he couldn't support. But I'll bet you he wouldn't have got in the way of two office supply companies that wanted to merge. That's what I'm getting at.
But now, I mean, on the flip side, so you take a look at what happened last Friday with Kraft making an unsolicited offer for Unilever.
Right.
And there's a lot of redundancy there.
And Unilever told them to.
Well, they basically said we're not interested.
I'm doing the scratch
working
symbol.
working with a company that's domiciled, in the UK is a lot different than working with a company that's domiciled here in the US. So the rules, the regs are different, the reporting is different. But so that was potentially 143 billion. So I can't speak on behalf of Kraft and their board, but they're not going to waste their effort and energy and resources if they think that the administration would flat out turn it down. So I think it kind of sends mixed signals right now, Harry, as to what what our president and what his administration is going to do. But let's kind of walk this back here for a second. So, we talked about potential economic growth in the near term. So individuals, businesses, they're going to have potentially more money. So that's going to increase consumer spending, and that's going to increase business investment. The question, Harry, how are they going to pay for this? Because you just can't cut and not have the revenue that's necessary to fund government. I mean, I know that Trump came out and said immediately, I'm not hiring. All hiring we're freezing with the exception of the necessary military.
Time out. How come we always look at the revenue that's lost? In other words, I know I'm going to hear it, and you're going to hear it, and it will be particularly one party, but it will also be members of the other party, and they will say, it's too rich. We can't afford this because we need a certain amount of money to run the government. Why don't we ever build in the growth that will happen because of doing it?
Well,
nobody ever acknowledges that happens.
No, I think we talked about that a bit earlier, and what will happen with earnings per share. But they need to supplement. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You just can't depend on the consumer, going out and spending. I mean,
I think you can count on a couple of things. The fact that every time it's ever been employed, it has worked. That in the 1980s we had the greatest peacetime expansion in American history. That when President Kennedy did it in the 60s, it works because if you tax people fairly, the government seems to achieve record revenue into the coffers. Now, I know under these confiscatory policies that we've had, we've also set records to the Treasury. But what do we have for it? $20 trillion in debt. So this is business 101. You have to spend less. You have to spend smart. You have to grow the economy. And I think you grow the economy by giving the American people and by giving corporations more of their money that they get to keep, because then they will spend more, they will invest and reinvest, they will hire more people, and then at the end of the day, we grow in a superior manner than we do if you confiscate too much from people.
I agree, but not in its entirety. So there's a couple things that potentially could happen. And last week there was a lot of discussion, Harry, about the border adjustment tax.
Yeah.
So and how that could potentially impact, respective companies. So what would happen is, as we discussed, corporate tax rates, personal tax rates are going to be cut. Companies that do a fair amount of importing or manufacturing some of their products, overseas, obviously are going to be impacted. And we felt that last week in the equity markets. And one other item has been floated out there, with respect to deductibility of interest expenses, to pay, for some of these tax reduction proposals. Now, that's what will happen is companies that use a lot of leverage and issue a lot of debt, it's going to be less attractive for those companies to do so. So who wins and who loses in all this? And again, Harry, this is very, very early on in the process. So think about this. Financials, that particular sector. If corporate tax rates are lowered, and financials for the most part, Harry, did not participate in the rally that we've seen over the last 8 years, up until just after the election. Technology, we is also a possible winner. If that's if you can in fact do a lot of this repatriation and bring those profits back here into the U.S. and then ultimately small caps. Small caps represent domestic U.S. businesses will probably be less impacted by this border adjustment tax. Now, for those that win, you're going to have those that lose. Now, it doesn't come as any surprise if you look at what's happened with retailing within the last 2 to 3 months. I mean, other than the fact, Macy's beat the number this morning, but I don't know what's happening with their stock price. If the border adjustment tax is implemented, that's going to obviously hurt retailers because of all the imports that they do. Consumer goods stocks they could also be impacted. And last but not least, and you look at energy and you look at telecom, because if interest expenses are being the deductibility of those is being phased out, it could very well impact both of those particular sectors. Telecom, AT&T, Telecom, Time Warner, Telecom, potential merger that the president elected at the time, and now the president is not typically kind of. Now, this is certainly not set in stone, Harry, because literally we can walk out of here today at 10:06 and the world gets turned upside down because something else happened.
I'll tell you another thing. If this promise to create, if a merger that you're against as a candidate promises to create X amount of jobs and stimulate this amount, of positive action in the economy, something you were opposed to, you could
but what happens with mergers and acquisitions typically? You have a lot of redundancy.
True.
And with redundancy comes reduction of workforce.
But that's typically management, not your rank and file. It hits all.
It hits all parts of a company.
See what you think about this one, Chuck. I'm very curious to your reaction to this. The President of the United States is very, very big on buy American and build things in America again. Now, obviously, we don't have sweatshops. We have collective bargaining agreements. We have, obviously our payroll and fringe benefits packages are very, very rich compared to places around the world where they're paying pennies to make things. People always wonder why, hey, we used to make all the TVs and radios, Motorola and all these. Now they're Moto, by the way. Hello, Moto. That's another commercial. But here's my question to you, Chuck. Whether it's the steel to build the Keystone XL pipeline or the Dakota pipeline, or other areas where the president, in automobile manufacturing, where the president wants people to buy American, build in America, based on the economies of scale and the competition around the world that we really can't compete with. We wouldn't want to because we won't treat our people the way these folks are treated in these sweatshops and so on. But is this a realistic approach in 2017?
Oh, Harry, I think it's realistic with rose-colored glasses to a certain extent, because if you think about the cost of manufacturing steel, pipeline, goods and service, retailing, clothing, what is the cost to manufacture that domestically versus being outside of the U.S., and what is going to be the cost to bring those goods in, with the new tax, and how does one offset the other? So it's, Harry, it's still certainly very much in motion, and it's going to take some time. In a perfect world, you build and buy America, but there's going to be situations where that's just not going to be achievable. So, the fact that I think I think today's discussion was pretty interesting because it didn't focus so much on the market. Well, it did to a certain degree with the markets, but sort of more
all the things
more
that affect.
So think about Washington. We always talk about Washington and what's happening several hundred miles south of here, and you watch them make sausage, but Washington is certainly open for business. There's no doubt about it, as more so than it's ever been, certainly over in the last 8 to 10 years.
Just a point of value I want to add. I don't always, but I've mentioned it many times over the past more than a quarter of a century, that literally the seat of our government is a half a tank of gas away. and so few people ever take the time to get there.
Yeah,
and see
you're
it.
right, and
Isn't that crazy?
It is an interesting,
and it's a wonderful trip.
Yeah,
if you go to Ford's Theater and you go to Smithsonian, there's so much to see there. You just have to pick and choose because you can't see it all in one stay. Take a trip over to Arlington National Cemetery. You can literally go to Ford's Theater and walk up. They have it now encased in like a bubble plastic or something, glass around the box where President Lincoln and his wife and the secretary and were situated for the play. You can walk right up the back steps. You can see the hole in the door. You can then go down these other steps. You can walk across the street. You literally go to the home where they took President Lincoln and this tiny bed that he wasn't even able to sit totally stretched out in. They had him kind of sideways, and the pillow still has the blood from his head. Yeah, I mean, this is all right there, and you see the Capitol building. I think it becomes much more real when you see it in person as opposed to what.
Yeah,
what
but here's
people,
you're right. But here's what happens. So I said they're open for business.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be business as usual. Think about this. I mean, we've had a year, Harry, where literally the unexpected became reality. Who would ever thought that a year ago that Donald Trump would be the president?
Me.
Well, I know that, but I'm saying who?
Well, you asked. Not many.
Thank you.
Not many.
The great majority thought otherwise.
Right.
So what you have to do, Harry, is any legislation that's out there, you can't view it as improbable or unlikely. I mean, there's a chance that things will happen. So from an investor's perspective, you really need to take an unbiased assessment of looking at the potential impacts of all potential reforms as they come out of the White House or come out of Congress.
Chuck, we are 3 minutes already on overtime, and if you'll stay for 3 more minutes, I want to ask you to give us a minute and a half or so on the Fed, what's happening, and also on the Greek bailout deadline.
So, Harry, if you take a look at the Fed, I mean, it didn't come as any surprise what happened with respect to the most recent comments that were made, by the Fed president. The bottom line is that, Janet Yellen basically reiterated, the case for potential rate hikes. You've had a number of really, really strong economic reports, a few that you just mentioned earlier this morning. So they're going to probably make a move in the first half of this year.
She can't wait.
As early
can't wait.
as early as next month when they have their meeting in March.
They couldn't go slower for 8 years. She can't wait. I mean, I
my
love job.
I'm going to quote her. What she said was that it would be risky to wait too long to raise interest rates.
Yeah, like a decade to 11th year is going to end the
and that the committee would consider hiking rates in coming meetings.
Of course.
So,
just as I predicted.
The forecasters that go out, and again, they're not always right either by any way, shape, or form. With the increase in equities last week, the fact that rate expectations, on a sort of a going forward basis, showed a 50% plus likelihood rate hike, not only in March but also in May.
Yep.
So now, you're probably talking 2 to 3 potential rate hikes, I think, as you get to into this year.
Right. More in 1 year than the previous decade.
Well, I guess we're going to get off of our annual rate hike in December, so to speak. So
yeah.
Now, well, let's close. I see we're on overtime. There's been, we haven't really heard anything about this, but Greece doesn't go away. I mean, so now you have the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the Eurozone finance minister. They're at odds here, Harry, as to the direction of the bailout process. They hope to iron out a deal early this week and getting into next week, and to allow the IMF to release 7 billion euros to aid Greece ahead of the European elections, which are going to kick off next month. So, the creditors hope they keep Greece out of the picture with respect to a campaign issue as elections start in Netherlands and then in France and then,
Germany.
Yeah, so, Greece's debt obviously is unsustainable. We've talked about this. It seemed like years ago.
Yeah.
And it kind of went off. It kind of went off the radar,
like it always does, and then it comes back. Disproportionate to reality, though, isn't it, Chuck? I mean, let me give you an example. And a good friend of mine wrote this in a little while ago. You know him well. Brexit was unexpected, and it has gone great. So I know that markets don't like to be surprised, but look how that turned out. Remember how bad that was going to be? Oh, it won't pass because they can't leave the European Union because, and now the United Kingdom has the highest GDP on the planet.
Yeah, there's been obviously a lot of discussion of movement of jobs, away from that part of the world back to the U.S. But yeah, GDP is certainly the answer, and the UK has done actually very well. But again, Harry,
they
remember,
confounded every expert.
But nothing has happened yet. I mean, it's sort of everything is in motion, but they haven't sort of pulled the plug.
But if it wasn't good, they would have been punished for what they did.
Oh, absolutely.
So
I mean, there's no doubt about that.
There's enough evidence that it's a positive. Chuck, as always, best in the business. Chuck Malamut, our official financial advisor for the Hurley in the Morning program for all of your financial planning needs, 609-383-2010. Tell Chuck and the entire team that I sent you Hurley in the Morning. Great
Harry,
stuff.
thanks. See you again next week.
You know it, my man. And thanks for your help with that project that we'll talk about next week. 53 minutes past the hour. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Open forum, and I'm going to give you a window in to my column for this week. And I think we really do hit the nail on the head with respect to District 2. And I think you're going to enjoy this week's column a lot. It'll be delivered to your home tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. It will be available in the near future at shorenewstoday.com. But you will get a sneak preview here as a Hurley in the Morning exclusive next.